The news did not arrive with fanfare. It did not come through any official channel. It came the way bad news always travels fastest, through whispers, through side channels, through a second-hand data relay that somebody forgot to lock. The GSV unyielding horizon was dead. That was the word people used. Dead. Not damaged. Not crippled. Dead. And when a ship that measured 2 kilometers from bow to stern earned that word, people stopped what they were doing and went very quiet. Until the Battle of the Uran Passage. The ship believed it. The ship was designed to believe it. When a Varith warship reads catastrophic failure across all primary systems, it does exactly what it is supposed to do. It shuts everything down. It locks every loop. It protects itself from a disaster that, in this case, was not fully real. The reactors went cold. The engines died. The weapons went dark. And the unyielding horizon, 2 kilometers of gray-black battle steel, drifted to a stop in the middle of the Uran Passage like a body that had forgotten how to breathe. The crew was evacuated over the following hours. Emergency pods, support shuttles, anything that could carry people away from the dark hull. Of the 4,000 crew members, the vast majority made it out. A handful of engineering officers stayed behind, ordered to remain as skeleton liaisons in case anything changed. Nothing changed. The ship stayed dark and cold and silent. 11 days passed. The Varith Engineering Corps sent their best people to assess the damage. Senior Artificer Gorith led the evaluation team himself. Gorith was a name that carried weight in Accord engineering circles. He had personally overseen the refit of 3 Horizon-class vessels. He understood these ships the way a surgeon understands a body he has operated on dozens of times. He spent 2 full days aboard the drifting hulk, going through every reading, every system log, every piece of data the dead ship could still offer. On the 3rd day, he released his verdict. It was formal, precise, and completely without hesitation. The cascade failure had destroyed both the primary and secondary power loops. The tertiary failsafe systems had not engaged. They showed as non-responsive across all diagnostic checks. Without functioning tertiary systems, there was no legal restart pathway available under Varith engineering doctrine. A full recovery would require the ship to be towed to a dry dock facility, stripped to her frame, and rebuilt from the inside out. The process would take no less than 3 years and cost resources that, frankly, might be better spent building a new ship entirely. The unyielding horizon was a total loss. Salvage teams were placed on standby. The order to begin stripping the hull of recoverable components was prepared and sitting on Admiral Sereth Val's desk, waiting for his signature. Sereth Val did not sign it immediately. He sat in his command chair on the fleet's command deck and looked at the horizon on his scope for a long time. She was visible as a dark shape against the stars. No running lights, no engine glow, nothing. Just mass, just metal, just a thing that had been a ship and was now, apparently, becoming a memory. He signed the order on the 4th day. On the human support station Alcott post, a man named Dale Rourke read the engineering report and ate his noodles. Dale was the delegation's chief field engineer. The title was grander than the job. In practice, it meant he was the person they called when something broke and nobody else could fix it. He had been doing variations of that job for 20 years, first on merchant vessels crossing the rough transit lanes of early human space, then on Accord support facilities, and now here, on a small station where the coffee machine broke every other week, and he fixed it every time without being asked. He had gotten the Horizon's damage report through Commodore and Briggs, who was his direct superior and possibly the most quietly dangerous person Dale had ever met. Briggs had a gift for obtaining information she was not technically supposed to have without ever doing anything that could be described as wrong. She had placed the report on Dale's terminal with no message attached. No instruction, just the data. Dale had read it twice. He had underlined 3 sections with a grease pencil, a habit so old he no longer noticed he was doing it. Then he had folded the underlining in his mind and held it there while he finished eating. He put down his fork. He looked at the wall. "That's not a dead ship," he said to nobody in particular. "That's a ship that ran out of people willing to look at it properly." Briggs appeared in the doorway of the small break room as though she had been waiting for exactly that sentence. She probably had been. "I've already drafted the access request," she said. "Gorith will refuse the first one. I need you to tell me honestly whether it's worth pushing for a second." Dale picked up the report again and looked at the 3 underlined sections. The tertiary failsafe status. The sensor array damage log. A footnote in the appendix about a mid-level relay junction that the assessment team had listed as collateral damage without further inspection. He looked at it for a long time. "Push for the second," he said. "Push for as many as it takes." What followed was 4 days of the most polite, most thoroughly documented, and most quietly furious bureaucratic negotiation in recent Accord history. Goreth refused the first request with a single paragraph citing the irrelevance of non-Verith engineering opinion on a Verith vessel. Briggs came back with a procedural footnote from the Accord founding charter, Article 7, subsection 12, which technically required the consideration of non-Verith alternatives before final salvage orders could be executed on any vessel within Accord space. Nobody had ever invoked it before. Goreth was furious in the careful, controlled way that very powerful officials express fury when they cannot actually do anything about it. Dr. Seleno Kai, the Accord's diplomatic observer for the Uran region, added his formal support to the request. His reasoning was simple. The charter was the charter. If the provision existed, it had to be honored. To ignore it would set a precedent far more damaging than the inconvenience of letting one human engineer walk around a dead warship for a few days. The permission was granted. 72 hours. 1 human. 1 personal toolkit. No Accord engineering support staff. And when those 72 hours ended, whether anything had changed or not, the salvage teams went in. Dale heard the news from Briggs with his toolkit already packed. It was a battered hard case with worn clasps and a handle that had been re-wrapped in grip tape twice. It weighed about 18 kilograms. It contained no Verith-compatible diagnostic hardware, because Dale did not own any. It contained tools he had carried for 15 years, physical instruments, contact probes, mechanical keys, a roll of thermal diagnostic tape, 3 glow sticks, a flask of coffee, and a folded paper notepad. A Verith fleet officer watching the departure from Alcott Post's docking bay made a comment to his colleague. The colleague replied. Neither of them said it loudly enough for Dale to hear the words, but he did not need to. He had seen that particular expression on alien faces before. It was the expression of someone watching something they found almost sad. Dale sealed his helmet, stepped into the small transfer shuttle, and looked out the forward viewport as the pilot set course for the horizon. She was enormous. Even from a distance, even dark and cold and silent, the scale of her was something that hit a person in the chest rather than the eyes. 2 kilometers of warship just hanging there. Hull plating scorched and cracked in sections. A long tier running across the midsection where something had hit her hard. Frozen gas trails drifting away from damaged vents in long, slow curls, catching the distant starlight and turning it pale blue. She looked like a ruin. She looked like something that had given everything it had and then been left where it fell. Dale looked at her for a long time as the shuttle crossed the distance between the station and the hull. Then he opened his notepad to the first page and uncapped his grease pencil. There was a lot to look at. He intended to look at all of it. The maintenance access port was on the lower port side of the hull, roughly halfway along the ship's length. It was not the main entrance. The main airlocks had no power and therefore no function. The maintenance port could be opened manually from outside, a failsafe that every ship in the Accord built into its design, because even the Verith, who believed deeply in their own engineering, understood that there might someday be a situation where you needed to get inside a ship that could not help you get inside. He was inside the unyielding horizon. He activated a glow stick, chemical, simple, required no power from any system, and held it up. Pale amber light pushed back the darkness about 3 meters in every direction. Beyond that, the corridor stretched away into nothing. Dead panels on the walls. Dead screens. Dead everything. The only sound was the slight hiss of his own suit's air recycler. Something moved in the darkness ahead. Dale did not reach for anything. He waited. A figure stepped into the edge of his glow stick light. Tall. Gray armor. Dull, without power running through the suit systems. A Verith female, young by the look of her bone structure, with the careful posture of someone who was trying very hard not to look like she was uncertain about anything. She wore the rank markings of a lieutenant. Her name, Dale would learn in the next 30 seconds, was Yura. "You are the human engineer," she said. Her Accord standard was precise and slightly formal. The way people speak a language they learn from textbooks rather than conversation. I am, Dale said. Dale Rourke. You're the liaison they left aboard. Senior Surviving Engineering Officer. Lieutenant Yura. I was ordered to remain and provide assistance. She paused. Her eyes went to the glow stick in his hand, then to the battered hardcase toolkit at his side. Then she said nothing further. But her expression said something. It said, this is what they sent. Dale did not explain himself. He never found explanations useful before the work started. He just looked down the dark corridor and said, I want to start in Subdeck 9. Can you get me there? Yura blinked. The main damage assessment began at the reactor core. Senior Artificer Goritha's team started at the point of. I know where Goritha's team started, Dale said. I read the report. I want to start in Subdeck 9. Another pause. Yura was the kind of person who filed everything into categories very quickly, and right now she was clearly having trouble finding a category for Dale. She settled on, follow the human and see what he does. This way, she said, and turned into the dark. They walked. Dale talked as he walked, not to Yura specifically, more to the air around him, narrating what he saw in a low voice. Frost on the wall panels here. Burn scoring on the ceiling junction there. A power conduit that had blown its housing and left a dark streak along 20 meters of corridor wall. He noted things. He made small marks in his paper notepad with the grease pencil. Yura watched him do this and said nothing, but she watched very carefully. Dale crouched in front of the junction node and looked at it for a long time. He asked Yura, when the cascade started, which systems went offline first, primary loop or secondary loop? Yura answered without hesitation. Primary loop first. Secondary followed within 4 seconds. And the tertiary lockout, was it logged as an active lockout or a system failure? A pause. The report listed it as a system failure. Non-responsive across all checks. Did anyone do a physical check? Contact probe, not remote diagnostic. Longer pause. The area was assessed as high risk due to residual heat from the initial cascade event. Remote diagnostics were used as standard protocol for safety reasons. Dale made a mark in his notepad. What temperature were they reading in this section when Goritha's team came aboard? Yura thought. Approximately 60 degrees Celsius. Too high for safe manual access under protocol. And by the time they finished the full assessment, approximately 40. Still above protocol threshold. Dale nodded slowly. He stood up, turned around, and looked at the corridor they had come from. Then he looked back at the junction node. Then he made another mark. The ship didn't fail, he said. The ship protected itself. There's a difference. Yura stared at him. The tertiary systems are non-responsive. That is failure. Or it is a system that is responsive to something that the diagnostics aren't asking it the right question about. He picked up his contact probe from the toolkit, a simple device, handheld, with a physical needle that made direct electrical contact with a terminal surface rather than using remote signal. I'm going to need you to answer more questions as we go. And I need you to tell me when you don't know the answer instead of giving me the nearest thing to an answer you can find. Can you do that? Yura looked at him with the expression of someone who had just been told something professionally insulting in a way that was technically polite. Then she squared her shoulders. I can do that, she said. They spent the next 3 hours going through Subdeck 9. Dale checked every relay state he could physically reach with the contact probe. Most were dead. A few showed residual charge, too small to mean anything by themselves, but Dale wrote down every one. He asked questions constantly. Yura answered them when she could and said, I don't know, when she could not, which happened 3 times. Each time it happened, she looked like it cost her something. Dale did not comment on it. What he found, or more precisely, what he started to understand, was not a picture of total destruction. It was a picture of a system that had done exactly what it was designed to do. Every relay that had blown in a sequence. The sequence had a direction, and the direction meant that the cascade had not simply destroyed everything in its path. It had been managed. The ship's own internal logic had been managing it, routing failure away from critical nodes, sacrificing some systems to protect others, like a person using their arms to protect their head. The ship had been thinking, even as it was dying, even as everything went dark. Dale sat back on the floor of Subdeck 9 with his back against the cold wall and looked at his notepad. 3 pages of marks and lines and numbers. He looked at the junction node again. He looked at the frost on the wall. Your ship, he said quietly, almost to himself, is smarter than everyone gave it credit for. Yura was standing a few feet away. She heard it. What do you mean? Dale looked up at her. The tertiary loop didn't fail. It was locked by something that is still active. The ship shut itself down to protect itself from a damage reading that was partially wrong. It's been sitting here for 11 days waiting for someone to tell it the emergency is over. Yura was very still. That is not possible. Gorath's team ran full remote diagnostics, Dale said, on a ship whose sensor network had partially burned out. They were asking the ship questions through a telephone line with a broken wire. The ship couldn't answer properly, so it looked like silence. It wasn't silence. He closed the notepad. I need to get to Junction Block 7. That's where the active system is. That's where the lockout is coming from. Yura transmitted his assessment to the fleet. Gorath's response came back in under 10 minutes. It was measured, polite, and completely dismissive. The human engineer had misread a residual power signature as an active system state. This was a common error for those unfamiliar with Varith power architecture. His assessment was noted but not actionable. Salvage protocols remained on schedule. Dale read the response on Yura's comm display. He read it once, all the way through. Then he picked up his toolkit and looked at Yura. Where is Junction Block 7 from here? Yura looked at him for a moment. There was something shifting in her expression, not quite belief, but the first crack in disbelief. Secondary engineering spine, she said. Deeper in. Right then, Dale said. Lead the way. They went deeper into the dark ship together, the small amber light of a single glow stick moving through corridors that had not seen light in 11 days. While somewhere far behind them, the salvage teams waited on their schedule, and the greatest warship in the Third Fleet hung cold and silent in space. Waiting, perhaps, for exactly the right person to ask it the right question. By the second day, the paper diagram covered 3 full sheets. She was starting to think she knew which. Dale had slept 4 hours. Exactly 4, on a fold-out crew rest surface in the anteroom, wrapped in the thermal blanket from his kit. He had not asked for permission to sleep, and he had not apologized for it either. He had simply said, I need 4 hours, lain down, and been asleep before Yura had finished forming a response. Yura had not slept. She had spent those 4 hours going back through the ship's original engineering logs from before the battle, cross-referencing them against what Dale's contact probe readings had found. She had not expected to find anything useful. She had found 2 things she could not explain, which was 2 more than she had expected. When Dale woke up, he ate a protein bar from his kit, drank from his flask, and went straight to the diagram. He did not look tired. He looked like a man who had been handed a puzzle and was annoyed it had taken him this long to see the shape of it. I need to explain what I think is happening, he said, and I need you to tell me if any of it contradicts something you know about this ship that I might not. Yura stood at the other end of the diagram. Go ahead. Dale pointed to a section near the center of the diagram, a cluster of lines converging on a single marked point. The cascade started here. Subdeck 9 junction node. The weapon pulse came in through the sensor network and told the primary loop it was experiencing catastrophic failure. The primary loop believed it. It began emergency shutdown. He moved his finger along a line. The secondary loop detected the primary going down and interpreted it as a real failure event. It followed. That part is in Gorath's report, and it's correct. Agreed, Yura said. Here is where Gorath's report stops being complete. He pointed to a separate cluster on the diagram, connected to the main section by a thinner line with a question mark at one end. The tertiary loop should have been the next to go. That is the standard cascade sequence for a Horizon-class vessel. But it didn't go the same way. The tertiary loop started to engage its emergency restart protocol. It was doing the right thing. It was trying to bring the ship back. Yura was very still. The report states the tertiary systems are non-responsive. They are non-responsive to remote diagnostic queries. But look at this. He tapped the question mark section. Junction Block 7 sits between the secondary loop's lockout relay and the tertiary loop's restart pathway. When the secondary loop went into full emergency shutdown, it sent a lockout signal to Block 7. Block 7 received that signal and locked out the tertiary restart pathway. It was following procedure. You do not want the tertiary loop trying to restart while the secondary loop is still in active failure mode, because the power surge could cause additional damage. He paused. Let her follow it. But the secondary loop is not in active failure mode, Yura said slowly. The words came out carefully, like she was testing each one before she allowed it. The room was very quiet. The ship, Yura said, very carefully, has been locked out of its own restart sequence by a dead sensor. By a dead sensor feeding ghost data to a relay that is still physically functional. Dale pointed at the marked location on the diagram. Junction Block 7. The relay inside it is not destroyed. I would bet everything I own on that. It has been sitting there, active, doing its job, holding the lockout in place because it genuinely believes the secondary loop is still in catastrophic failure. If someone resets that relay manually, tells it directly, with a physical key, to clear its lockout state, the tertiary loop's restart pathway opens up. The ship's own emergency protocols take over from there. She knows how to bring herself back. She just needs someone to tell her that it is safe to try. Yura stared at the diagram for a long time. She was a trained Varith engineer. She had studied under 3 senior artificers. She knew this class of ship better than almost any junior officer in the fleet. And she was running Dale's logic through every framework she had, checking it against every system manual she had memorized, looking for the place where it broke down. It did not break down. If you are correct, she said quietly, then the horizon has been recoverable this entire time. Yes. And Gorith's team missed it because they never did a physical check of Block 7. Because the temperature in that section was too high when they arrived. And by the time it cooled down, they had already written the ship off and were doing documentation for salvage, not looking for new answers. Another long silence. The route to Junction Block 7, Yura said, passes through Section Mid-4 of the secondary engineering spine. There was a structural collapse there during the battle. The corridor is partially blocked. How partially? A Varith engineer in a work suit would not fit through it. The minimum clearance for a Varith in standard equipment was roughly 90 centimeters in both dimensions. Dale looked at the measurements. Then he looked at himself. He was not a large man. Medium height, lean from years of working in tight spaces. His work suit was not the heavy armored kind. It was a slim profile engineering suit, built for getting into access tunnels and cramped maintenance bays. I'll fit, he said. Yura looked at him, then at the measurements, then back at him with an expression that was difficult to read. It was not quite respect. It was not quite disbelief. It was the expression of someone recalibrating. I will guide you through via suit comm from outside the collapse zone, she said. I know the section layout. Good. Let's go. The walk to Mid-4 took 20 minutes through the cold, dark corridors. Neither of them talked much. There was a different quality to the silence now. It was not the silence of 2 strangers who had nothing to say to each other. It was the silence of 2 people who had too much to do to waste time on words that were not necessary. The collapse zone looked worse in person than the schematic had suggested. A section of the ceiling had come down, and the floor below it had buckled upward under the impact, creating a narrow, jagged tunnel through what had been a normal corridor. Twisted metal edges caught the glowstick light and threw it in strange directions. The whole thing smelled of old smoke and burn insulation. Dale stood at the entrance and looked at it for a moment. He thought, briefly, about a cargo hauler off the coast of Newfoundland. A cracked coolant manifold. A storm so bad that half the crew were sick below decks. He had crawled into spaces smaller than this one to fix that manifold. He had been 24 years old and his hands had been shaking, and he had fixed it anyway because there was nobody else to do it and the ship needed it done. He took a breath, got down on his hands and knees, and went in. Yura's voice came through the suit comm. Steady, precise, exactly what he needed. Left at the second bend. The floor is uneven for about a meter after that. Go slow. There is a piece of decking that protrudes from the right wall about halfway through. You will need to go around it on your left side. Junction Block 7 was 30 meters ahead on the right wall. He found it exactly where the diagram said it would be. A recessed panel, slightly larger than the others around it, with a physical latch rather than the electronic release that most panels used. He opened it with the mechanical key from his kit. A simple tool, basically a shaped rod, standard equipment for any engineer who worked on systems old enough to have physical failsafes. Inside the panel was the relay. It was exactly what Dale had expected to find. A solid-state relay unit, physically intact, showing a steady amber status light. Active, locked, doing its job. Not burned. Not destroyed. Not failed. Just doing precisely what it had been told to do 11 days ago when the sensor it depended on had died, and left it holding a lockout order with nobody to call and no way to check. Dale looked at the amber light for a moment. Then he inserted the mechanical key into the relay's reset port, a port that existed in every Varith relay unit for exactly this kind of situation, because even Varith engineering doctrine understood that automation sometimes needed a human hand, even if the hand they had imagined was a Varith one, and he turned it. The amber light went out. For 2 full seconds, nothing happened. Then, from somewhere very deep inside the ship, something changed. A sound that was not quite a sound. More of a feeling, a vibration that came up through the floor and into Dale's knees and hands. A deep, slow, mechanical exhale, like a chest expanding after holding its breath for a very long time. Dale pulled his hand back from the panel and listened. The feeling grew. Very slowly. Very quietly. But it grew. "Yura," he said into the suit calm. "I hear it," she said. Her voice was different. Quieter. Like she was trying to hold something carefully in both hands and did not want to drop it. "I hear it." "Start a clock," Dale said. 18 hours. Give or take. What happens in 18 hours? Dale closed the relay panel gently, like closing the cover of a book, and picked up his toolkit. "The ship wakes up," he said. The horizon did not wake up the way stories describe these things. Not warm in any dramatic sense. Warm the way a room gets warm when you have finally fixed the heating and it is slowly remembering what its job is. The temperature inside the corridors began to rise by fractions of a degree at a time. Dale tracked it on his wrist display. -14, -12, -9. Each reading came slowly, spaced apart by long minutes. But the direction was clear. The direction had not changed in the 11 days before this moment. The ship's tertiary reactor loop was pulling itself toward ignition through its own emergency restart protocol, a sequence that the Horizon had been trying to initiate for 11 days and had finally, after one mechanical relay reset by one human engineer with a grease pencil diagram and a kit of old tools, been given permission to attempt. It was going to take time. That was fine. Dale had time. He had approximately 17 hours and 50 minutes of it left. He spent the first 2 hours of the restart sequence moving through the ship's key monitoring points, watching the process develop and checking for deviations. This was not exciting work. It looked like a man walking slowly through dark corridors, pressing a contact probe against panels every few minutes, writing numbers in a notepad, and frowning sometimes and not frowning other times. Yura followed him and read the panel labels aloud, so he did not have to stop and translate them himself. She had stopped questioning what he was doing. She had started helping him do it faster. On the fleet command deck, instruments registered the first power signature from the horizon at the 2-hour mark. It was small, barely above the threshold of what the sensors would normally flag as significant. A junior sensor officer noticed it and reported it quietly to the deck supervisor. The deck supervisor looked at the reading, then at the horizon on the scope, and then transmitted a query to Yura's comm. Yura confirmed. The restart sequence was in progress. The command deck went from quiet to loud in about 4 seconds. Admiral Sareth Val came onto the deck from his private office. He had been there, not resting, reading operational reports with the particular focused blankness of a man who is trying to occupy his mind. He looked at the sensor reading on the main display. He asked one question. Was it stable? The sensor officer said it was increasing slowly and steadily. The admiral looked at the reading for a long moment. Then he went back to his chair and sat down and said nothing, and nobody else said anything either, because everyone in that room understood that this was not yet a moment for celebration. It was a moment for watching very carefully. Gorith, notified of the power reading, issued a formal statement within the hour. It described the reading as likely a residual energy event, a secondary release from damaged capacitors as they naturally discharged, or an anomalous reading caused by sensor interference from the salvage team's nearby equipment. He recommended that the data be flagged for follow-up review and that no protocol changes be made on the basis of a single ambiguous reading. Nobody on the fleet deck argued with him openly. Nobody agreed with him openly either. Inside the ship, Dale was aware of none of this. He was crouched in front of a secondary conduit array in the forward section, frowning at a reading that had deviated from where it should be. The restart sequence was not going perfectly. He had not expected it to. An 18-hour cold restart on a ship that had been through a cascade failure was never going to be a clean process. There were going to be moments like this one, where a system tried to come back online and came back slightly wrong, and if you did not catch it and correct it, the wrongness would propagate into the next system and the next one after that, and eventually the whole process would trip itself and stop. This particular deviation was in the voltage regulation of two secondary conduit arrays in the forward section. They were attempting to restart at approximately 8% above their rated voltage, which was not catastrophic on its own, but would become a problem in about 40 minutes if it hit the junction point ahead of them and tried to push that excess into the tertiary loop's main feed. Dale pulled out his notepad and looked at the mapping diagram he had made on day one, his full physical survey of the ship's relay and conduit layout, done by hand, written in the cramped shorthand he had developed over 15 years of doing this kind of work on ships that did not always have functional diagnostics. He had noted, on that first day, a section labeled Interesting in the margin near the forward section. An auxiliary pathway, not in the original schematics he had been given, but physically present in the ship, running parallel to the main conduit route and connecting to the same endpoint by a different path. He had not known then why he marked it. He marked interesting things because interesting things sometimes mattered later. It mattered now. He rerouted the forward conduit arrays through the auxiliary pathway. The excess voltage had room to regulate itself over the longer route. By the time it reached the junction point, it would be within normal parameters. How did you know that pathway was there? Yura asked. She had been watching him work. Found it on the first day? Wrote it down. It is not in the engineering schematics. It is not in any official documentation I have access to. Yura absorbed this. Varith engineering doctrine requires that all modifications be logged in the official record. Varith engineering doctrine also said this ship was dead, Dale said, not unkindly. He picked up his toolkit and moved on to the next checkpoint. Something changed between them around hour 6 of the restart sequence. It was not a dramatic thing. No single moment that could be pointed to. It happened the way gradual things happen, imperceptibly, until it had already happened. Yura stopped shadowing Dale like a supervisor monitoring a contractor she did not entirely trust. She started moving with him the way a partner moves, anticipating where he was going next, having the panel open before he asked, knowing which readings he needed before he requested them. She had spent years learning this ship. She knew its corridors the way people know the streets of a city they grew up in. She knew which hatches stuck and which panels had bad latches and which route through the midsection was 3 minutes faster than the official layout suggested. She started giving Dale that knowledge freely, not because she had been told to, because she could see what he was doing with it. Around hour 14, they sat in the engineering anteroom and waited for a synchronization cycle to complete. The room was noticeably warmer than it had been when Dale arrived. His breath no longer fogged inside his suit. Yura had partially unsealed her helmet, enough to breathe the ship's air, which was another sign. The environmental systems were beginning to function, the air processors turning over, the composition of the internal atmosphere slowly improving. Yura asked him how he had learned to work this way. Dale thought about it for a moment before he answered. He was not a man who explained himself often, not because he was secretive, but because he had spent most of his career around people who could see the work and did not need the philosophy behind it explained. Merchant vessels, he said. Old ones mostly. Ships that had been running for 30, 40 years with maintenance budgets that were always too small and schedules that never left enough time for a proper refit. Things broke constantly, sometimes in the middle of nowhere, with no resupply, no support crew, just whatever you had in your kit and whatever you could figure out. Yura listened. You learn something, working on ships like that, he continued. A machine that is damaged is still trying to run. That wanting, whatever you want to call it in engineering terms, it is built into every component. Things are designed to function. When they stop functioning, they do not stop trying. They just start asking for help in a different language. If you get quiet enough and pay attention to what the system is actually doing instead of what the manual says it should be doing, you can usually understand what it needs. Yura sat with that for a while. She looked at the diagram on the wall, Dale's 3 pages of hand-drawn lines and numbers. The relay in Block 7, she said. You were certain it was still intact before you physically reached it. Reasonably certain. Certain enough to crawl through a collapsed corridor for it. What would you have done if you had reached it and found it destroyed. Dale shrugged, gone back to the diagram, and looked for the next candidate. There were 2 other locations I had marked as worth checking. She stared at him. You had backup options. You always have backup options, he said. The first theory is where you start. It is not where you stop. The synchronization cycle completed. The display on Yora's wrist unit updated. Dale leaned over to read it, and his face changed slightly. Not a smile exactly, but something in the region of a smile. We're past the halfway point, he said. Reactor output is climbing inside the safe band. Environmental systems are at 60%. We've got power routing to the primary lighting grid. As if on cue, because the timing of machinery sometimes produces moments like this, and nobody plans them, and they are the better for it. The lights came on. Not all of them. Not immediately. It started far down the corridor outside the anteroom door, a single strip of white light blinking on. Then the next panel. Then the next, a chain of illumination moving steadily toward them and past them and continuing further into the ship, one panel at a time, steady, unhurried, certain. Dale and Yura stood in the doorway and watched it. The horizon's main corridor lighting stretched hundreds of meters in each direction. The lights came on along all of it, in both directions simultaneously from some central origin deeper in the ship, spreading outward like a wave. White light replacing darkness that had been sitting there for 11 days. Every panel activating in sequence. Every screen on every wall flickering to life and running startup diagnostics in the neat, precise columns of Verith text. The ship hummed, a low, deep sound, more felt than heard. The sound of a power grid coming alive and systems finding their rhythm and everything beginning, slowly and carefully, to become what it was meant to be. Yura looked at the lights for a long time. She had been aboard the Horizon for most of her engineering career. She knew what the ship looked like lit up, had seen it thousands of times. But she stood there looking at it as though she had never seen anything like it before in her life, and in a sense she had not, because she had never seen it come back. Dale looked at the lights for a moment. Then he looked at his flask. He had been rationing the coffee. There was not much left, and the ship's galley systems would not be functional for several more hours. There was 1 cup remaining, cold now, unpleasant. He drank it anyway. It was the best cup he could remember having in a while. Then he sat down, opened his notepad to a fresh page, and began writing his incident report. Old habit. You wrote the report while the details were still sharp, before the next problem arrived to push the last one out of your head. Outside, in the cold of space, the lights of the unyielding horizon were coming on one by one, visible from the fleet formation beyond, small bright points appearing on a hull that had been dark for 11 days. On the fleet command deck, nobody spoke. The admiral watched his scope and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The evidence was making its own argument. She put her team on hold and watched her scope. On the scope, the unyielding horizon was doing something that a total lost vessel absolutely should not be doing. It was glowing. Not glowing in a dangerous way. Not the orange heat glow of an uncontrolled reaction or the white blaze of an explosion in progress. The quiet, steady, organized glow of running lights coming back on. Navigation beacons activating. Engine housings beginning to emit the faint warmth of systems under controlled low power. The shape of the ship on the scope was changing from a cold, dead silhouette to the recognizable energy signature of a vessel in startup mode. The salvage coordinator put her coffee down and did not pick it up again for a very long time. For separate confirmation signals were required before the fleet's automated protocols would accept that the Horizon's power readings were real and not a sensor anomaly. The signals came from Dale's handheld transmitter, from Yura's suit comm, from the ship's own reactivating internal transmitter, and finally from the fleet's own close-range sensor array after it was repositioned for a direct reading. For confirmations, the system required 4 because it had been designed with the assumption that a false positive on a total lost vessel would be the more likely error. On the 4th confirmation, Admiral Sereth Val authorized crew reintegration. 40 skeleton crew members crossed from the support vessels to the Horizon over the next 3 hours. Navigators, engineers, systems officers. Enough people to take the ship from emergency restart to stable, independent operation. They crossed in small groups, through the main airlocks that now had power and could function as airlocks were meant to. The first group to board came through the main forward airlock and stepped into the primary crew corridor. The lights were on. The air was warm. The environmental readouts on the wall panels showed normal atmosphere, normal pressure, normal temperature. The ship's central systems were running their startup sequences on every screen, columns of Verith text scrolling steadily in that organized way that meant everything was in order. Several of the officers stopped walking and stood in the corridor. Not because something was wrong, because something was very right, and they had not expected to be standing in this corridor ever again, and the feeling of it required a moment to process. One of them, a young navigation officer who had served on the horizon for 3 years before the battle, put his hand flat against the wall. He held it there. The wall was warm. The ship was warm. The ship was alive. Nobody who saw it mentioned it in any official report. It was not the kind of thing that goes into official reports, but everyone who saw it remembered it. Senior Artificer Gorith boarded the Horizon 6 hours after crew reintegration began. He came with 2 documentation officers and an official inspection mandate. He was not the kind of man who arrived without documentation officers or without a mandate. Every action Gorith took existed within a formal framework, because that was how Verith of his seniority operated and had always operated, and he saw no reason to change now. When the inspection was complete, Gorith's 2 documentation officers found somewhere else to be. The senior artificer stood alone in the engineering anteroom. On the wall, still taped there, was Dale's 3-page hand-drawn diagram. Gorith looked at it the way a master craftsman looks at something made by a different method than his own, with the particular attention of someone trying to understand a logic that comes from a different place than the logic he uses. He read it for a long time. Dale was packing his toolkit nearby, refastening the worn clasps on the hard case one by one. He did not look up. He knew Gorith was there. He was giving the man space to arrive at whatever he needed to arrive at in his own time. Gorith turned from the diagram. He looked at Dale. "How did you know the relay was still viable?" he asked. His voice was exactly the same as it was in his official communications. Measured, precise, empty of emotion in the way that very controlled people keep their voices empty of emotion. But he had asked the question. That was its own information. Dale set down his toolkit. "I checked it. Physically. With this." He held up the contact probe. The remote diagnostics couldn't reach it properly because the sensor network between Block 7 and the diagnostic interface was partially burned. But Block 7 itself was past the burn zone. It was still there, so I went and looked at it. The temperature in that section was above safe protocol limits when our team assessed the ship. It was below protocol limits by the time I arrived. 2 degrees below, technically, so I was right at the edge. But it was accessible. Gorith absorbed this. The collapsed section in mid-4 was also assessed as a safety obstruction. It was an obstruction, Dale agreed. I fit through it. The relay should have been checked, Gorith said. He said it flatly, as a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of a gap in his team's process. For Gorith, this was the equivalent of a significant personal admission, and everyone in the room knew it, and he knew they knew it, and he said it anyway. Dale picked up his toolkit. It's a hard thing to catch when you're working against a temperature window and a schedule. I had the advantage of coming in later, when things had cooled down. Different circumstances. Gorith looked at him for a moment with an expression that was impossible to read entirely, but which contained, somewhere in it, something that was not quite respect, and was not quite relief, and was not quite the particular discomfort of a highly competent person encountering a form of competence they had not anticipated. It was probably all 3 of those things mixed together in proportions that Gorith himself might not have been able to name. He said nothing further. He took his documentation officers and left. Admiral Sareth Val requested a meeting with Dale the following morning. It was held in the captain's briefing room on the horizon, a room that was fully functional now, lights on, climate-controlled, screens running. The Admiral was already there when Dale arrived. He was standing at the viewport, looking out at the fleet formation. The horizon's hull was visible from this angle, curving away below and ahead, her running lights on, her engine housings glowing with low-power warmth. Val was tall even by Verith standards. He was old enough that his scales, the fine, flat scales that covered Verith faces and neck and forearms, had darkened with age to a deep gray-green. He wore his rank markings without the kind of performance that some senior officers put into their uniforms. The markings were simply there, accurate and sufficient. He turned when Dale entered. He did not speak immediately. He studied Dale in the way that senior military officers sometimes study people they have heard a great deal about, taking the measure of the reality against the account. Then he said, "The Horizon is my ship. She has been my ship for 9 years. I gave the salvage order because my best engineers told me she was gone, and I had no basis to contradict them." He paused. "I will not contradict you by claiming that this outcome was expected or that it was the result of anything other than what it appears to be." Dale waited. "It was not total loss," Dale said. Not argumentatively, just accurately. It was said simply, no elaboration. The implication was clear, and Val intended it to be clear, and Dale took it the way it was meant, not as a job offer, not as a formal proposal of any kind, but as the closest thing a Varith Fleet Admiral comes to saying, "You are someone whose existence I am now taking seriously." Dale nodded. "I hope they stay healthy," he said. "But if they don't, you know where to find me." Something crossed Val's face that might, in another species, have been the beginning of a smile. He turned back to the viewport. Dale left the briefing room with his toolkit in hand and his notepad in his jacket pocket, and Yura waiting for him outside the door. She had written her supplementary report. She told him this as they walked. 30 pages, full technical documentation of everything that had occurred from the moment Dale boarded. She held out a folded printed copy. "You put it on paper," Dale said. "You put things on paper," she said. "I have decided there are situations where it is the better format. A screen can be cleared. Paper is harder to make disappear." He took it. He read the summary paragraph. She had stopped at the bottom of the first page, the non-standard personal notation at the end. It recommended study of the diagnostic approach. Coming from a Varith officer in an official report, that language was extraordinary. He folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket next to his notepad. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you," she said. She said it in the precise, formal way of someone who had decided to mean it completely. Neither of them said anything else. They walked down the corridor of the living ship together, the lights on above them, the hum of active systems around them, the sound of a crew beginning to return to their places and their work. Somewhere in the Accord's bureaucratic machinery, Dr. Selen Okai's report was already moving through the channels. It was a long report, thorough and carefully sourced, and its final section asked a question that would take a long time to fully answer. If this is what a human engineer can do with 11 years of Accord membership, what becomes possible in 50? It was a good question, the kind that tends to stay with people. 6 months is a short time in the life of a galactic institution. The room was not comfortable for anyone. 17 species, 19 representatives, a climate system that had been calibrated as a compromise and therefore satisfied nobody completely. The temperature was slightly too warm for the Keth delegation and slightly too cool for the representatives of the Dulhuri, and the lighting was at a wavelength that the Varith found acceptable, but that gave the 2 Marin delegates a faint, persistent headache they were too polite to mention. Meetings of this body had always been conducted under these conditions. It was considered a reminder that the Accord was not built for any one species in particular. The agenda was long. Administrative items, curriculum review updates, a proposed revision to emergency training protocols. Near the bottom, listed as item 14 of 17, a joint proposal from Lieutenant Commander Yura. She had been promoted 2 months after the Horizon incident, and Dr. Selen Okai of the Keth delegation. The proposal requested the inclusion of human methodology field diagnostic frameworks as supplementary material in Accord engineering training programs at the advanced level. The committee reached item 14 late in the session. Several members had the posture of people who had been in a meeting room for too long. Dr. Okai presented the proposal. He was concise. He referenced the Horizon incident, referenced Yura's 30-page technical report, referenced 3 subsequent engineering assessments that had independently verified Dale's repair approach as sound. He referenced a line from one of those assessments that described the methodology as empirically grounded and systematically replicable despite being undocumented in existing Accord literature. He answered 4 questions. One of them was skeptical. He answered it without becoming defensive. Senior Artificer Gorith was on the committee. He had been on it for 11 years. He sat in his usual seat at the far end of the table and said nothing throughout the presentation and the questions. When the chair called for discussion, he waited until the other members had spoken, and then he said, briefly and in the precise language of a man who has thought carefully about his words, that he had personally reviewed the methodology in question, that he found it to have merit in specific field conditions that current Accord training did not fully address, that he supported the proposal. He said nothing else. He did not elaborate. He did not reference the horizon or his own team's findings or any of the history that everyone in the room already knew. He simply stated his position in the clearest possible language and then was quiet. The proposal passed. 12 in favor, 2 abstentions, no votes against. Item 15 was a discussion about standardized power coupling specifications. Life in the Accord continued. The GSV Unyielding Horizon went back into active service 10 weeks after the incident. Her service record was updated with the standard notations for a vessel returning from repair status. The repair entry listed 2 names, Lieutenant Commander Yura and Field Engineer D. Rourke, Olcott Post-Human Delegation. She was assigned to the 2nd Fleet's patrol rotation in the Uran region, the same region where she had been crippled, which was either poetic or simply practical, depending on how you looked at it. The Varith were generally practical people. Her crew complement was rebuilt to full strength. Her systems were certified at operational standard. Her engines, running on her own power through the tertiary loop that had been waiting patiently for 11 days to do its job, performed without any issues. Yura had quietly, without announcement or policy declaration, altered the standard phrasing used in the ship's maintenance briefings. The old phrasing, standard across the fleet, described a system exhibiting failure indicators as a compromised system, diagnostic output unreliable. Yura changed it to compromised system, diagnostic output may be limited, physical verification recommended. It was a small change. 4 words added, 3 words modified. The meaning was significantly different. The first version said, "Do not trust what this system tells you." The second said, "The system may still be telling you something true. Go and listen properly." Several of her engineering crew noticed the change. None of them asked about it. They simply updated their working procedures accordingly. On Olcott Post, Dale Rourke received his promotion to Senior Field Engineer of the Human Accord Delegation. It came with a slightly larger office. The office had a viewport. He looked at the stars through it for approximately 3 minutes on the day he moved in, which was longer than he usually allowed himself for things like that. And then he set up his desk and put his toolkit in the corner and got back to work. Commodore Briggs received a formal communication from the Accord's Central Council 2 weeks later. It was long and written in the layered diplomatic language that such documents always used, which meant that the actual content was distributed across 8 pages that could have been expressed in 3 paragraphs if anyone involved had wanted to be direct. Briggs was very good at reading this kind of document. She found the core of it on page 5. The Accord was expanding the human delegation's operational mandate. Field engineering access to additional Accord vessels and facilities. 2 new support postings. Increased resource allocation. A formal invitation for human engineers to participate in cross-species technical exchange programs currently open only to the 5 oldest member species. Briggs read to the end of the document. She put it on her desk. She looked out her viewport for a moment at the space beyond Olcott Post, the same space that had been there before, the same stars, the same distant smear of a nebula. Nothing had changed out there. Everything in the document on her desk said that something had changed in here, in the station, in the delegation, in the regard of the people they had been quietly trying to earn respect from for 11 years. She sent Dale a message. It said only, "Told you so." She read this, and this time she did allow herself to smile, and it was not a small one. 8 months after the Horizon incident, a young Varith engineering cadet named Sarah was given an assignment. She was in her 2nd year, posted to a training vessel on rotation, and the assignment came from her supervising instructor as part of a new module that had recently been added to the advanced curriculum. The module was listed simply as Field Diagnostic Methods, Non-Standard Conditions. The assignment was a scenario. It described a simulated power system with a cascade failure, primary and secondary loops down, tertiary loop showing as non-responsive on all remote diagnostic checks. The scenario stated clearly that standard repair protocol had been applied and had found the system non-recoverable. The question was, what would you do next? Sarah read the scenario twice. She ran the standard diagnostic logic in her head. The standard diagnostic logic confirmed what the scenario said, non-recoverable. Tertiary systems down, no restart pathway, and a process. She almost wrote that down as her answer. She had her stylus in her hand. She put the stylus down. She read the scenario again, more slowly. She looked at the specific phrasing, tertiary loop showing as non-responsive on all remote diagnostic checks. She thought about the word remote. She thought about the section of the new module that she had read the night before, the part that discussed the difference between a system that was non-responsive to a query and a system that was non-functional. She pulled up the simulated schematic. She looked at the sensor network between the diagnostic interface and the tertiary loop. She found a sensor in that network that the scenario had noted as damaged in the initial cascade. She traced the signal path from the diagnostic query through that sensor to the tertiary loop's relay. She found the relay. Not the tertiary loop. Not the end destination of the query. The relay in the middle. The one that had received no signal from the damaged sensor and was therefore holding a lockout in place that no longer needed to be held. The one that was, in the simulation, still active, still functional, still doing its job with perfect and useless faithfulness. She picked up her stylus. She wrote, I would physically verify the state of the relay at the following junction point. She wrote the junction point coordinates. She wrote, if the relay is physically intact, I would reset it manually. I believe this would clear the tertiary lockout and open a restart pathway. She submitted it. Sarah read the notes several times. She thought about the human she had never met. She thought about what it would take to find that answer not from a schematic in a classroom, but in a dark and frozen corridor on a dead ship with a grease pencil and a paper notepad, and nobody backing you up, and 11 days of institutional certainty stacked against you telling you that there was nothing left to find. She folded the assignment printout and kept it. Dale Rourke, on the same day that Sarah kept her printout, was 40 meters inside a Keth mining station's primary cooling system with his contact probe and his glow stick and his notepad. The system had been declared non-recoverable by 3 engineering firms. He had read all 3 of their reports on the shuttle ride over. He had underlined things in all 3 of them. He was talking quietly to the pipes, not in any meaningful sense, not in a way he would have described to anyone who asked. Just the low narration of a man moving through a system and noting what he saw, what the readings said, what felt wrong, and what felt only slightly wrong, and what felt, underneath all the wrongness, like it might still be trying. The Keth station manager was waiting outside with the particular expression of someone who has been told to expect a miracle and does not believe in miracles. 2 of his staff were with him, holding coffee that had gone cold, listening to the sounds coming from inside the access hatch. The sound stopped. Then came a different sound, quiet at first, a low mechanical hum, hesitant, finding its rhythm, then less hesitant. Then, steadily and without drama, the sound of a system that had been stopped and had now, given the right information at the right time by the right person, decided to start again. The station manager stared at the access hatch. One of his staff started to say something. The hatch opened. Dale came out, brushing dust off his knees, notepad in his jacket pocket, toolkit in hand. He looked at the station manager. He looked at the readout panel on the wall beside the hatch, which was now showing something it had not shown in 3 weeks. Normal operating parameters, climbing steadily toward full capacity. She needed 1 relay reset and a secondary bypass on the intake coupling, Dale said. The bypass used a conduit that's not in your official schematics, so you'll want to get that documented. The relay itself is fine, just needed someone to tell it the emergency was over. The station manager looked at the readout panel, then at Dale, then at the panel again. 3 firms, he said. I know, said Dale. He fastened the clasps on his hard case. Sometimes it takes someone who's willing to look at what the thing is actually doing instead of what the reports say it should be doing. He picked up his toolkit. You'll want to run a full systems check over the next 6 hours to confirm stability. Should be fine, but check anyway. He walked toward the exit. He had a shuttle to catch. He had Briggs's latest message in his jacket pocket alongside his notepad, and the message had a list of 3 more facilities that had been declared non-recoverable by somebody, and the list had come with a note that said only, when you're ready. He was always ready. That was the thing about Dale Rourke that people who worked with him eventually understood. Not the cleverness, not the methodology, not the ability to crawl through collapsed corridors or read machines like they were speaking directly to him. What they understood, eventually, was simpler than all of that. He just never walked away from a thing that was still trying. 11 years ago, humanity had arrived in the Galactic Accord with a single support station and 2 translators and a deep collective suspicion that no one was going to take them seriously. They had been right about that. The Accord was old and set in its ways and full of species who had been doing things their own way for centuries and did not feel the absence of human input particularly keenly. That was changing. Slowly, the way real things change, not in speeches or ceremonies or formal moments of recognition, but in one relay reset at a time, one 30-page supplementary report, one cadet who kept a printout, one proposal that passed with 12 votes in a committee room where the temperature was never quite right for anybody. Not loudly, not quickly, but it was changing. And somewhere in the corridors of the Galactic Accord, in the engineering manuals being quietly revised and the diagnostic procedures being carefully updated, and the training modules being opened to new methods that had not existed there before, something was being written into the record that could not be easily removed. Humanity and the universe, slowly and in its own time, was beginning to notice.